Today we're going to be covering the use of some of the vector tools in a little bit more detail. And the tool we're going to be using for this is the pen tool. Now, part of the purpose of the pen tool is to create a vector shape that you can resize or adjust in any way possible. But another thing that the pen tool is fantastic for is for producing a selection, and not just a selection that any of the lasso tools or the marquee tools could make, but a very detailed, tight selection that some of those other tools, because of the nuances of the way that they're used, do not offer. So just to kind of recap, by default, typically the pen tool is set to shape. What that means is it produces, and I'm going to just adjust this so that you can see it. When you use the pen tool to create a shape, and I just used straight lines here, it produces a shape that allows for you to fill or apply a stroke. So the fill is the interior space. Think you drew an outline, it's the space inside of the outline. The stroke represents the outline itself, okay? For the current assignment that we're going to be dealing with, because we're taking a photo that's in black and white, and we're going to be fully colorizing that photo, you are not going to set it up to have a fill and a stroke. You're only going to set it up for a path. And the difference between shape and path is it will just show you what that line is doing. A good example, I'll turn this guy back on. If I were to turn off the fill and the stroke, this is just the path. This path, which is made up of spaces between the points and points themselves, this is the vector element. This is the object that we can resize infinitely up and down and have it retain quality. So this is the magic behind a vector shape. Any vector shape, even if I produce maybe a custom shape, any custom shape that Photoshop has pre-built, so I'll pick a little flourish. Every single one of these shapes is made up of a path and points controlling that path. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be producing a path around these objects to colorize them in. So around each portion of the photograph that you want to color in, you're going to use the pen tool to produce the path, and then you'll turn it into a mask and be able to fine-tune the mask. So I'm going to back up here. So an important thing to notice, the shapes that I produced, because I made them as a shape and not a path, show up on the layers panel. If you use the pen tool to create just a path, it's not going to produce a layer. I'll delete this. But you'll notice that there's a paths panel. This is going to be where all of your paths are going to be stored. So to use the pen tool, it's pretty simple. You start with a click to establish where your path starts. If you just click and release in the next point, it's going to make a straight line. If you click and drag, this allows for you to make a curve. The handles that come out are what enable you to manipulate that curve. So every time you produce a new click point, if you click and release and do not click and drag, it will maintain straight lines. If you click and drag, it will create a curve, and then your next point will produce a curve that counters the prior curve. It's important to recognize, and I'm going to turn the rubber band option on. This is an option that's going to make it a little easier for you to learn how to use this tool, because it will give you a preview. See the line, the path that's being pulled out by my cursor? It's going to give you a preview of how the tool functions. So rather than having this turned off and hoping you get the point in the right spot, this lets you kind of visualize before you click. So an important thing to know is that whenever you create a curve with a path, it's going to automatically attempt to counter it in the opposite direction. This is the math working. So it's going to say, okay, if you make a curve in one direction, it's going to automatically attempt to counter with one in the identical same direction. Don't get frustrated if you're trying to kind of make a scalloped edge or like an M shape. You're just going to have a little bit of intuitive work to go with it. So I'm going to click. I've produced sort of this S shape, or like a hill and a valley. Now, because I've completed my curve, if I clicked again, it's not going to give me a curve because the math has completed its shape. So if I wanted to make another curve similar to what I've got here, I would have to click and drag again, and then you can see it would counter it as it sees fit. You can also see in the Paths panel, there's a work path for the current path, but nothing on the layers. This is okay. This is what it's supposed to do. An important thing to recognize is if you click out of your work path and maybe start something different, work paths are just sort of a temporary layer, and you can see that the prior sort of hill and valley shape that I was making has disappeared. Let me hit undo a couple times. So if you produce a path and you don't want to lose the information, you need to double click on that path and save it. I'll call it my curve for right now. This is how you save the path to Photoshop. If you do not save your work path and just leave it as a work path, and let's say you're done working in Photoshop, you need to back up and work on something else and then come back to it later, that path will not be saved to your Photoshop document, to your PSD. So you need to make sure that if you produce a path that you want to use that isn't just for practice, you need to double click on it and save the path. Okay, so I've been working with the pen tool. The pen tool just lets you create shapes using the click and drag method. Add anchor point lets you add additional anchor points to the path to let you maybe make further, more detailed alterations to the path that you currently have. Delete anchor point removes points. So if there are points that maybe I don't want to use, I can delete them, but it does stand the chance of affecting the way that the path currently functions. So I've no longer got that nice smooth shape. It's a little bit less than what it was. Fortunately, paths can be infinitely adjusted just like they can be scaled. Path selection, this looks like a black arrow. The path selection tool lets you pick up a whole path and manipulate the whole path as a single unit. The direct selection tool lets you manipulate parts of a path. So that could be one whole span of the path. I'm just clicking and dragging on the shape. It can let you manipulate the handles. you'll also notice that if I wanted to make like an M, like think McDonald's Golden Arches, it can let me adjust that. But you can see here, what happens to one side of a point is going to happen to another side of the point. So this is great if you want to manipulate just certain parts, like I could move one point around because I'm directly selecting it. But to lift this curve upwards without affecting this curve requires the Convert Point tool. And this lets you manipulate parts of a path independently of what other curves may happen to be doing. So I could affect this side with this handle, and I could affect this side with this handle, and not affect either side of that point at the same time. So an important thing to remember is affecting one can affect the other with direct selection. Now, if you've already used the Convert Anchor Point tool, and that's what these points are called, anchor points, if you've already used it, you're usually in okay shape and one won't affect the other. But if you've still got that nice S-curve, you may need to swap over to the Convert Anchor Point tool to manipulate it. So let's take some of these methods that we've covered and let's trace a photo. So let's say I wanted to take one of these orchids and I wanted to make a selection of that orchid and change its color. So rather than having a bunch of pink and peach orchids, maybe I wanted to have a blue one. I'll grab my pen tool and I'm going to go slowly. I'm going to at least try to go slowly. I tend to sort of whiz through this tool. And because unfortunately you can't make a path any thicker visually than it already is unless you are using the shape panel, and if you have poor vision and you want to use shape and give it a stroke that's thicker just to make sure that you can see what's going on, I'm okay with that. I can live with that. But I'm going to use the paths setting because I don't need to give it a cartoon outline. I just want to get a path. So I'm going to start at a point that I can find easy to see. So I'm going to pick where some of the petals overlap. All right, so there's my starting point. So I'm going to use this to just sort of trace the outer border of the flower. And I don't need to be perfect. I'm going to click and drag, and I'm just going to wait till my path kind of overlaps with the petal. And in this case, you can see that it counters, but it does leave, if you look up here, it does make a little bit of an adjustment. Okay? And I'm going to go back in and finish that. So let's come down here to the direct selection tool. Now if I do this, it's going to mess up this side. So, Convert Anchor Point tool, I'm going to grab the handle and I'm going to adjust the best I can. Now, it's still not quite right. It's not grabbing enough of the petal here and it's going over the board here. I might need to click and drag on this other handle, this other anchor point, to pull out additional information. And you can see the petal still dips in. This might be a good opportunity for me to add an additional anchor point, because now I have more handles to add additional control to the way that the shape is supposed to look. Okay, when I'm ready to continue, I go back to my pen tool. In this case, it remembers where I left off, so you can see that I'm attached again. If you aren't sure, like let's say you switched tools completely, did something different, and then maybe, let's see, and then maybe came back to it. in some instances, it won't return. So you can see here, it sees that the path is still there, but you see how my cursor is acting as though I'm starting a new path. That's what the little star asterisk next to my cursor means. What that means is I need to go to either end of my path, and you see how as I hover over it, it shows what an anchor point looks like with a path, a tiny little path on either side. This means I'm ready to continue a previous path. If I just click anywhere, it's going to erase the work that I've done and create a whole new path from scratch. So by clicking here, I'm now reattached and I can continue. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key to switch over to my move hand, like my little hand tool, so that I can see more of my image. And I'm going to continue attempting to make some selections. Now if I start getting stuff that's really unattractive here, that's alright. Just switch on over to the Convert Anchor Point tool. Oops, I detached myself accidentally. Oh, and now I've created a whole nother path, and that's not what I want. So I hit the delete key, select my path, reattach, there we go. One of my favorite things about the pen tool is it's not difficult to use hotkeys. Control or Command on a PC, or excuse me, Control on a PC or Command on a Mac will let you switch between the pen tool and the direct select tool. If you press Alt on either computer, it'll switch over to my Convert Point tool. So rather than stopping my work, clicking over here, doing a super small adjustment, and then coming back, I can jump between all of the tools that I would typically use and not have to slow down. So I'm going to make a general adjustment here. Now if you see, like you can see here that this pedal dips in a little tiny bit, you can see that if I go anywhere else on my path, you can see I've got a little plus sign. That means I can add an anchor point anywhere between two current anchor points. So if I decide I need a point here, I can click on the path, it'll adjust and give it handlebars, and then maybe I can use, in this case I'm on a PC, so I can control click, reposition it, then Alt to adjust the handles. If you can see here that my path is attempting to like curve way around, another nice thing about the Convert Anchor Point tool is I can get rid of curves on it. So I can click on a point and it will get rid of the handlebar that's causing problems and straighten it back out for me to start over. So the goal of using curves, the whole purpose of this is to get as tight a selection as possible all right, so you can see, and I'll put a big amount of space between this. I don't need a lot of points to get the results that I want. I just have to be smart about placement and the way that I'm using certain parts of the tools. As was mentioned previously when we first started covering vector at the very beginning of the term, the more points you have, or excuse me, vector in and of itself can be a method of image making that can require a fair amount of space and processing, oomph in order to give the results needed. So vector can actually result in a pretty big file size if you're not careful. So one of the reasons that paths and the curvature of them is so useful is it allows for you to retain a lot of detailed information without requiring a huge file. Because if I wanted to, I could just click, 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 click all the way around the flower and still get a pretty decent selection, but that's not even sort of accurate in relation to, I'm basically getting a big geometric shape that ends up looking like a flower in the end, when in reality I should be able to put a fair amount of space between the points and still get something that looks the way that I would expect it to in terms of the curves. So it's important to keep in mind that accuracy is important, but so is maintaining a low file size and still getting a good end result. And these last couple little bits I'm just going to touch up separate. Looks like I need another point in here someplace. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and double click, and I'm going to call it my orchid. Tell it okay. You can see now it is selected. If I do not have it highlighted in blue and you don't see the path here, that's okay. You just have to highlight the path. But my layers panel, other than my spare layer that I made earlier, is empty other than the backdrop. So to use the path as a selection, I'm going to select the layer here. I'm going to click this little icon down here. It looks like a dotted, a circle made of dotted lines. Think selection. And if you hover over it, it tells you load path as selection. So now it has highlighted that whole thing. Come back over to layers, click hue and saturation, blue, let's see, blue flower with green veins. That looks good so far. Or if I wanted to, click colorize and have it all be blue, kind of like how you would on a black and white photo. You can do that too. I kind of like the variation that I'm getting here though, so I'm going to stick with that. Now one additional region. I've colored the photo. Basic mission accomplished. But an important thing to keep in mind is edges. Because one thing that a path does that could potentially cause hiccups is if there's a spot where you have just a little bit of overlap with the background or another object, it can make a pretty drastic change here. Now, you can see in this example, I've got a little bit of overlap. I'm actually going to make a duplicate, because you can make a mask from a path in two different ways. One way is by loading it as a selection and then coming over to the layers panel and making a mask that way. However, another way that you can do it is you can select the layer itself and then create a mask that way as well. So there are two different types of masks here. One of them is a vector mask, meaning it's based specifically off of the path itself. The other way is the way that we did it before, which is considered a layer mask. Okay, and you can see that the two icons are different. One's got a gray background, one's got a black background, and they're both white where the changes are being made. Now the difference between the two is with a vector mask, the only way to remove that excess color is to make an adjustment to the mask itself. So I have to physically move the path in order to fix the problem area. But I'm still going to have a very sharp edge. Now, this is not my preferred way. It gets the job done, but it isn't my preferred way to work personally. Partially because you have to go back in and fix the path, but also because it gives you a very sharp transition. And if I had selected maybe one of these orchids back here where it's super soft along the edges, I can't do that with a path. It's 0 to 100. So I prefer a layer path because, one, it gives you the option to refine the mask and make it soft. So I can smooth it out, I can feather those edges, make sure that you output to the mask. But also because I can go in with my paintbrush and make corrections by hand as well. And I find that I'm going to get the closest, most accurate end result I possibly can when I can just go in by hand and tinker with it, versus hoping that I got the path as perfect as possible on the first try, which, you know, sometimes it's a little difficult. Remember, you're dealing with pixels. You don't have an opportunity using a vector mask to soften the edges this way. Vectors don't function like that. Okay. Same thing here. If I were going to trace this apple, most of the apple would be pretty simple. You know, you've got the whole apple. Let's grab the pen tool. I'll start here. You know, you've got these little water droplets that you'd have to take care of separately. But for the most part, dealing with the apple is pretty simple. Move this guy over. Little adjustments. So I'm going to pretend I'm not really paying attention and I caught part of the stem. Little adjustments. Don't need to be perfect the first time. In fact, often when I work, I'll go through and put in all of my quick adjustments ahead of time. Like, I'll just go in and I'll put all my points in. And it won't look perfect, but it'll be something to get me started. And then I'll go back through and I'll make little tweaks as I work. Now, you don't have to work that way. That's totally a personal preference type of thing. I'm going to get kind of simple and angular here, where it's a little bit out of focus. So usually I'll make a path first, and again, this is just the way I like to work, and then I'll go in and I'll make all of my tweaks. Grab my convert anchor point. If there is an anchor point that doesn't have, like let's say right here I need a curve, Just drag it out. Probably use another anchor point right there. And then drag the handles wherever you need them. Oops. Careful not to add too many extra points if you're not meaning to, though. It can be easy to do if you're not paying attention. Handles can go off the screen, by the way. Well, I'll try to include the shadow since the shadow is red. Fruit is a really good thing to practice this on, by the way. Like if you've never used the pen tool before, and it's, you know, perhaps the reference photo I've provided is just a little bit adventurous, start with something simple. An apple, a banana, you know, a flower. Those are really great shapes that have curves. They aren't symmetric, and they can give you like a starting point. All right, so path. Call it my apple. I'll call it A. All right, load it as a selection. Maybe I want a green apple. Ooh, purple's pretty. I like blue. Blue's kind of crazy looking. Now in this sense, you can see I missed a couple little dots. Parts of the shadows aren't quite fitting in. Right click, refine mask. Zoom out a little bit. You can see that it's cut off the stem. Adding a little feather. And maybe shifting the edge out just a touch. Helps to encompass most of it. So now you can see, oops, I forgot my good old stem. Maybe I don't want the stem to be blue. I want the stem to be brown the way that it is. If this was a vector mask, again, looking like this in the layers panel, I would have to go in and add additional points and bring it down and hope that it matches. But because I'm dealing with raster mask, even though I'm using a vector tool to create it, it's an easy fix for me to do. Not too bad. So that's the pen tool in a nutshell. Pen tool, oops, did not want to print. The pen tool is pretty easy once you learn it. The learning is the tricky part. If you can learn the pen tool, everything else in Photoshop in terms of the amount of dexterity and physical skill you need to use the tools, you know, I think the pen tool is the trickiest thing to get the hang of. Once you can do that, you can do pretty much anything else. So it gives you a lot of precision. So in relation to the start file that I gave the group, let me jump on over to my reference material here. So I gave you all this one. All right. So there are going to be some things to pay attention to. One, her hair is soft and kind of fluffy and blends into the background. Hard edges are not going to be appropriate there. So you're going to need to be able to soften that. You can see some skin through her hair. So you are going to want to maybe spend a little time there as well. So just make sure that the colors are showing through one another properly. A good rule of thumb when dealing with layers with masks and color, keep in mind that whatever's on the bottom and then whatever's on top of it, they're going to overlap, just like if you were overlapping sheets of paper. So if something is beneath something else, in this case she's got her shoulder, and then the hair's on top of it, and then this kind of coin object kind of ringing around her face, it's like a little headdress, is over her hair. Take into consideration what layer, what order your layers need to be in, because otherwise colors could conflict. It may not look right. Okay? There's a lot of softness here. The entire image needs to be colored. This includes her eyes, her lips, her hair, her clothing, the backdrop. The whole thing needs to be colorized. There should not be any gray areas. Now, in some cases, the color may be very faint because she is pale. If you take a look at, in this case, when we softened the edges, the white is very forgiving with the way that colors appear. So you may have to add some blending modes to make sure that the colors you select come up the way that you think they ought to look. But I have full confidence that this shouldn't be too difficult. Please make sure you use paths to make every single mask that you produce. That includes all the pretty little coins. Okay? Things like the hair, where it's very soft and fluffy, you can generalize that. I don't expect you to make a path around every strand of hair. That's crazy. I'm not asking that of you. Another helpful hint: if you need to make a certain item all one color, for instance, I'm assuming that all of her hair is going to be the same shade of brown, try to make each portion on one mask rather than on several separate masks, because colors can be hard to match if you're not careful. So if you wanted to take a path and then add to it by making a separate shape entirely, rather than deselecting and then creating a new shape, like I've done here, now I've got two paths. Select the shape in question and then add to it. And if you can see both objects on the same path, they're going to be selected at the same time, even if they aren't attached, because they're on the same path. Just like if you wanted something on the same layer, you would put it on the same layer. So they work very similar in that fashion. Best of luck. Can't wait to see your questions and what you're working on.